Assalamu alaikum and welcome to our 13th education webinar. My name is Tariq Khalil. I am education coordinator with the American Muslims for Palestine. It is a pleasure to have two wonderful powerhouse speakers here today to discuss this very, very important topic. On October 19th, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, outlawed 6 Palestinian human rights organizations by declaring them terrorists and effectively criminalizing human rights work. Moreover, a forensic investigation by Frontline Defenders, confirmed by Amnesty International, revealed that a Pegasus spyware from the Israel-based NSO Group infiltrated those 6 Palestinian organizations months earlier. Israel controls where the NSO Group can offer its products, but there is still no global regulatory framework. Now it has been determined that U.S. officials have been hacked by the Pegasus spyware, and NSO Group is considering shutting down its Pegasus unit and selling the company. These 6 human rights organizations have been successful in their own right. These organizations are Adamir, Al-Haq, Defense for Children International Palestine, Union of Agricultural Work Committees, Union of Palestinian Women Committee Society, and Bisan Center for Research and Development. It's important to understand how powerfully influential these organizations are to properly understand Israel's motive behind all of this. All of these organizations work on different matters, but share a common vision. Adamir works on behalf of political prisoners. Its work is based on the universality of human rights. Bisan Center's works with poor and marginalized communities, youth, and women to achieve socioeconomic rights. Al-Haq strives to realize the aspirations of the Palestinian people in a free Palestine where human rights are respected, which is why one of its goals is to contribute toward remedying violations of human rights. Defense for Children International promotes and projects human rights of Palestinian children. Union of Agricultural Work Committees envision a free Palestinian farmers with food security and sovereignty over its own resources. And the Union of Palestinian Women Committees Society's purpose is to empower Palestinian women on all levels and to contribute toward the national struggle against the occupation. So their missions, their visions, their goals, their objectives are absolutely legitimate and in line with international law and norms. So why the designation? We have with us 2 powerhouse speakers, and I'm honored to introduce them both right now. Ubai Al-Aboudi, he's the father of 3. He's the husband of journalist Hind Shuraida. He has an MSc in economics focusing on development and social protection. He's the executive director of Bisan Center for Research and Development, one of the organizations that were designated. And he's the editor-in-chief of The Progressive, which is a Palestinian peer-reviewed journal on development in Arabic and on development and socioeconomic rights. Ubai is a human rights defender and a former political prisoner himself by Israel and by the Palestinian Authority. We're also honored to have Adam Shapiro, who is the head of communications and visibility for the Irish international human rights organization, Frontline Defenders, which I just mentioned earlier. In his role, he is responsible for campaigning with and for human rights defenders around the world and has developed a number of campaigns around mega sports events such as the Olympics and the World Cup. Adam has filmed human rights documentaries in Darfur, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Europe, and the United States. It's a pleasure to have you both here. Ubai, I want to start with you. I mean, this issue has developed over the last about 2 months or so. These 6 organizations have been targeted and have been designated as terrorist groups. And I just outlined the basic visions and missions of these organizations. One of them you work with. Why the designation if these works are so legitimate and focused on purely human rights?
Well, let's first say that these organizations are even older than the PA. The oldest one is Al-Haq, which was established back in 1979, which is now 42 years old. Bisan 1989, which is now 32 years old. So this was even before the establishment of the PA. We were established as part of the Palestinian society in its strive for democratization, for liberation, for emancipation from occupation, and all forms of injustices. These organizations have worked tirelessly over the past 40 years, let us say. Let's start with Al-Haq, from Al-Haq and going through the others, within their mandates on strategic plans, annual issues to achieve certain goals and aspirations that fall in line with achieving basic human rights, basic political rights, basic dignity and freedom for the Palestinian people. And I would say that these organizations, because their work is slow, yes, but it's accumulative. We accumulate our work year by year, and we are part also of the larger Palestinian civil society. And this civil society, I think, has started to bear fruit, whether it was the work of Al-Haq and Al-Damir and DCI and international advocacy, with the ICC, with the US Congress, with the EU Parliament. We are seeing, for example, with the McCullen Act on limiting the Israeli army's use of US-funded weapons or bought weapons from the US in its human rights violations against Palestinian children, or with Al-Haq's crackdown and follow-up on exposure, let us say, not crackdown, exposure of war crimes committed by Israel and the war criminal Benny Gantz in the ICC and their follow-up and documentation on that, or with the work of organizations like Bisan and UPWC and OWAC that work on the ground with Palestinian communities to increase their resilience and to counteract, I would say, the Israeli attempt of redesigning or social engineering of the Palestinian community. These organizations have worked all of those years and are, I think, essential parts of the Palestinian civil society. For example, Bisan, we are founding members of Palestinian Non-Governmental Organization Network, PINGO, which is the network of Palestinian civil society. Actually, we have the founding papers, the proposals for the documents that were written first for their establishment back at Bisan. We are also founding members of the NGO Forum for Combating Violence Against Women, which has been on the forefront in the last 20 years, advocating for women's rights. We actually had the first, what do you call it, the Women's Conference, Women's Rights Conference in the West Bank back in 1989. This was a central part of Bisan's work. And we are also Bisan, founding member of the Coalition for the Fight Against Corruption, AMAN, which is also doing a lot of work in exposing PA corruption and corruption in general with people in public offices. So this kind of work, when you're talking about it, this is independent, this is highly testified by our partners, by the UN bodies. This is also exposing the Israelis' violations. And for my understanding is that Israel is going through a phase of re-engineering the Palestinian community and even re-engineering what kind of civil spaces we have, what kind of gatherings we have, what kind of organizations are allowed or are not allowed. And if you look at the designations themselves, you would find out that their underlying motive is the work we are doing as organizations. Bisan, they are talking about our academic work because we do a lot of academic research on exposing asymmetrical power structures and violations against Palestinians, especially the poor and the marginalized. Al-Haq, they are accusing it of going into lawfare, which is exposing Israeli crimes in international arenas like the Human Rights Council or the Security Council or the International Criminal Court. So this is, in short, why it has come until now.
Well, I mean, obviously, if your work and the work of the other organizations have not been successful, have not been impactful, I don't think these designations would have even come about. Adam, I want you to focus on the cybersecurity element here. So, how is this really a dangerous endeavor? Should U.S. citizens be worried, not just government officials? I mean, how bad can this be? And talk to us about its impact on Palestinian society as well.
So, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in Frontline Defenders, to join this event, and thanks to Ubai and to you, Tarek, and for all the great work that ANP is doing, advocating for Palestine in the United States. on the one hand, cybersecurity or cyber, surveillance against Palestinians can easily trigger a reaction of folks who follow this conflict and follow the situation for a long time of, yeah, so what? Because after all, Palestinians' entire lives, whether they're in Gaza or the West Bank or in Jerusalem or in 48 or even as refugees, is almost entirely under some form of surveillance almost all the time, whether it's checkpoints, soldiers maintaining presences in villages and towns, or other means of technological or physical security, surveillance. That is happening around the clock. What is different about Pegasus and about the deployment of this kind of spyware is that it is happening in the dark. In this case, it happened against these Palestinian human rights activists without them actually taking any action for the spyware to be deployed. So it's a feature that was exploited in the Apple iPhones that meant that as a user of your phone, you didn't actually have to click on anything for your phone to become a tool of spying against you and against anybody else you were in contact with. And so that in and of itself is a new level of surveillance, a new level of spying on people that should worry anybody, not just for Palestinians. And this spyware has been used against people across the globe, not just Palestinians. Should be extremely worrying for that reason. As an American citizen, I'm extremely concerned, and I'm joined by Ubai here, who is himself an American citizen and who has been targeted by this spyware. Previously, the NSO Group and the Israeli government has stipulated that its spyware could not be used against American citizens. And yet, just in the last few weeks and months, we have learned that not only was it used against Ubai, who's an American citizen, in the previous dump of information that Amnesty International and forensic reporting discovered a few months ago, there were US diplomats who were targeted. And more recently, a new batch of American diplomats, it has been discovered, have been spied on with this Pegasus software. So the assurances that were previously given that American citizens somehow couldn't be targeted by this spyware have proven to be completely false. And the idea that somehow that rationale was accepted in the first place boggles the mind, because there's no technological justification for thinking that. The exploitation is not based on where your phone number is. The exploitation is based on what device you're using and the kind of software problems there are or flaws that exist in the coding of software, not in whether your number starts with a +1 or a +44 or a +970 or a +972. So that, this kind of acceptance previously by the American intelligence and security community to quote unquote buy what the NSO Group and the Israeli government were selling itself raises serious questions as to why we got to this point where we saw the American government take action by listing NSO Group by the Commerce Department and sanctioning it only after it was proven that American diplomats were targeted by the Pegasus software. Why didn't that sanctioning occur much earlier? Why didn't the US government take steps to warn not only American diplomats, but American citizens who work on these issues, who work on any issues related to any country in the world? It's working on relation to Saudi Arabia. We know Jamal Khashoggi and his colleagues were targeted by Pegasus software, which ultimately led to his murder. These are very big questions that still need to be answered by the American administration, not just this administration, but also the previous American administration as well. So I do think we have to be extremely concerned and worried. What is positive is starting to happen. Not only the US government taking the Commerce Department taking the action it did against NSO Group, but WhatsApp, Apple, and other companies starting to sue NSO Group in court is important. But it's not the end of the story. In fact, it's only the beginning of the story. We also know this week that Facebook took action to remove certain apps from its platform, apps that were almost all of them created by Israeli app creators and companies, which effectively were using the WhatsApp and Facebook platforms to spy on accounts, to take information from people's personal accounts and use it for spying. This was one of these companies, one of these apps was exposed in the Harvey Weinstein scandal, which, when it was reported originally, didn't quite get into the entire cyber surveillance element of what was happening, but it was shown, I think it's called BlackRock or something like that, which showed how an Israeli cyber company was being used to spy on individuals, to extract information from their accounts, and then to weaponize it against them. This is, unfortunately, if these companies aren't regulated, if these platforms aren't regulated, if it's left only up to the companies to decide which apps can be used and which can't be used in the future, we're going to be constantly chasing after damage is already done. And so we need more proactive regulation. We need more proactive effort by the U.S. government, by other governments, and in fact, we need international protocols on this. Compacts, global compacts, like there are against landmines, like there are against nuclear weapons. We need similar kind of compacts against the use of surveillance technology, which arguably is far more damaging and far more impactful on a much larger number of people and their personal lives than landmines, as bad as they are, or nuclear technology, as bad as it is. This happens, this affects people on an individual basis. It affects their families. It affects their careers. It affects their livelihoods. It affects everything. It affects their reputation. And we know once something goes on the internet, and once it's out there, it never goes away. So this is also permanent damage that can be created by this cyber surveillance software.
Wow, you say it in such a calm tone, but it sounds so dangerous. What this could eventually lead to. I mean, recent reports show that the NSO Group sold Pegasus to countries known to use surveillance technology to track dissidents, lawyers, journalists, and other members of civil society. So, in a way, it's dangerous yet useful for institutions and governments that want to be able to control and track what activists are doing, really, because it can access your phone completely undetected. Like, there's no way to detect it. I mean, is there a way to counter this? I mean, what can be done here? Because it sounds something that is uncontrollable, and we just have to deal with it.
So we can take some steps. I mean, certainly we can detect Pegasus now on certain devices and other types of cyber spyware that's out there. We are increasing, whether it's my colleagues at Frontline Defenders who work on this, Amnesty International's lab that works on cybersecurity, Citizen Lab out of the University of Toronto, and others out there are working diligently to monitor, understand where threats are happening, understand where flaws are, and then figure out where there have been exploitations and where there have been uses of the spyware. A lot of it, though, is waiting and finding out once an incident actually happens. So it's a reactive measure to a large extent. One of the reasons why is because the nature of this is that when a app or a device is updated or upgraded or developed, whether it's by Apple or Samsung or some other company, or the app makers, they put this software out there knowing that there could very well be flaws, knowing very well that there could be exploitations of their apps. And in fact, it's become common practice in the software sector to offer rewards to the individuals or companies who find exploitations and report them to those companies so they could be fixed. And that's what happened with Apple's iMessage. iMessage had a flaw. It was exploited by Pegasus and others, and subsequently was reported to Apple, and Apple fixed it. It has paid reward money effectively to those who found those hacks and those flaws. And that's kind of how this sector operates. And on one level, it's very democratic, right? It allows anybody who has the skills and the technology and the ability, who can figure out a flaw, to report it and to help improve the overall ecosystem. The problem is that there are nefarious actors in this ecosystem. And those nefarious actors are looking for those flaws, but not reporting them. They're exploiting them. And so the question is, how do we come up with a better system working with the technology companies, whereby if technology is put out into the world, into this ecosystem, where there are very likely going to be some sort of flaws that can be exploited, how can they move more quickly and more effectively to shut down those flaws and to stop the exploitation? And then what, on a state level, what kind of sanctions can be put in place to ensure that these companies who do this kind of exploitation, who enable this kind of exploitation, and the states who carry it out, how can they be sanctioned in a way that deters that behavior? Those aren't complicated questions, and those aren't new questions just because the technology is new. How to sanction rogue actors, how to sanction governments that abuse human rights has been going on for decades. Whether it's effective or not is certainly a debate. But there are the tools that exist to make sure that happens. The Commerce's Department against NSO Group is an example, but it's a tip of the iceberg kind of example, and it's very limited at this point. Much more should be done against the NSO Group at this point, especially now it's been shown to have not only targeted American citizens, but as I mentioned, American diplomats, including Rob Malley, who at the time was working on it was part of the Iran nuclear negotiations for the United States government. And it's very clear that Israel had a clear interest in sabotaging those talks and making sure those talks weren't successful. So hacking into his phone and knowing what was going on with his work was clearly an advantage for the Israelis to try to stop the potential success of the Iran nuclear negotiations.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, a lot of information to take in. Thank you for that. Ubai, I really I want to go back to the designation, because when this broke out, and people try to follow what happened and why the designation occurred, and then you see the basis of it. So Israel based that designation off of a law from 2016 that criminalizes all activities by an organization that are deemed to be terrorists, not that are terrorists, not that have done terrorist activities. If the government deems them as such, then they fall within the rubric of that law. So, do you see a shift to a more? I mean, it's always been hard line to one degree or another. Is the Israeli government moving toward a direction where it doesn't care about showing off its hardline stances, and it's just, finally declaring stuff, especially with a few years ago with the nation state law? They essentially took away the democratic component. They've always, projected this Jewish and democratic state, and the nation state law just focuses on the Jewish supremacy of the state. Self-determination is unique to the Jewish people. Are we seeing a trend within the government to say, hey, we're just gonna come out and just say it? We are a racist apartheid state, and you just have to accept it. I mean, is that the trajectory that we're in?
Well, I think that has been happening more and more. What have we been seeing in the past couple of years is Israel refusing to be apologetic on its war crimes that are being committed, and the war crimes are being more and more systemized and also endorsed even by non-state actors inside the Israeli community. Last week, there was an uproar in the Israeli community and political system that the Israeli Minister of Security said that he wants to fight Palestinian terrorism and quote also settler terrorism. So even the Israeli Minister of Interior, the well-known racist Ayelet Shaked, came out and said this is something insignificant, and the Israeli Prime Minister also talked about that. So this duality between a democracy and being a Jewish state, I think this is something that even the Israeli elites are saying, okay, this discourse doesn't work. We're just a state that supports the supremacy of one ethnic group over the other. And this is also systemized. I just want also to say that NSO is a private company. This private company, we have to go to the root causes. The 8200 intelligence unit in the Israeli military intelligence. This is the root cause of everything. If you want, from the cybersecurity, of course, the root cause of everything is the occupation and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. But the root cause of where the technology, where people are being trained, where mass surveillance is being conducted on Palestinians. The other day, there has been reports of a Palestinian Facebook done by the Israeli soldiers, which is called Blue Wolf. And we have been seeing that on Israeli checkpoints all across the West Bank. When you used to drive, and this has been happening for a couple of years, they would tell you to roll down your windows, photograph you, and also photograph your car with their smartphones. We did not understand why they were doing that. They were doing that systematically for all Palestinians that were passing through their checkpoints. And it turned out that they are using facial recognition programs, and they are employing that and using with that Israeli spread systems of cameras all over, not just the West Bank, everywhere in historic Palestine, in order to do facial tracking and population control. And this kind of systematic violation we are only seeing in governments like in China, where the reports of what's been happening with the Uyghurs and this kind of mass surveillance and mass control. And I think there was this great article by Human Rights Watch, Omar Shakir, and the person responsible for the China desk in Human Rights Watch on comparisons between the two systems. And I think there's also a deep level of cooperation. We have learned historically that all apartheid systems, all repression systems do cooperate systematically. The closest allies for apartheid South Africa was Israeli government, Israeli state. And this is also a historic fact. They did not boycott them. They used to sell arms to them. They used to trade with them. And all of this happened until the apartheid system in South Africa collapsed, and then the non-apartheid government of South Africa, which had a black majority, became not so friendly with the Israeli apartheid system. So this is historic. But I want also to emphasize one idea that maybe Adam didn't say right now. The most dangerous thing about NSO, from my understanding of Pegasus technology and technology like that, is that they take complete control over your device. Our colleague from Al-Haq, Ghassan Halaika, he found out that his phone was hacked by that it was making phone calls without him knowing that. So when he compared log of his phone with the person that told him that you called me, they were totally different. And this is quite dangerous. So for example, they can plant evidence on your device. They can plant software, malicious software on your device. They can, if they want to connect you to Al-Qaeda, they can have this kind of messaging system with Al-Qaeda operatives and then saying, okay, we confiscated your phone, we did a security check, and it turns out that there's evidence, cyber evidence that you are connected to Al-Qaeda. So it's quite scary. And I read from the Frontline Defenders website that this was actually also, or from the Amnesty, I think, it was also used in India for human rights defenders that were entrapped in this kind of method. And from our understanding also, this kind of mass surveillance of trying to control the Palestinian population falls into also a bigger category. We are calling it now an attempt to social engineer the Palestinian community. What we are seeing is that there are several systems of oppression and control where also cyber technology, like the Blue Wolf, which is the Facebook for Palestinians, what they did, where they are doing mass collections of DNA, fingerprints, eye scan, retinal scans, etc. for Palestinians. And they are doing that on checkpoints and border crossings where Palestinians really do not have a choice. If they do not want to comply, they will not be able to cross, to go to work, to travel, to do all of, to go even to hospitals. And this kind of systematic approach is also an Orwellian reality for us as Palestinians. We are having a state that decides which Palestinian is good, which Palestinian is bad. We have a state that's also deciding which kind of group organizing we are allowed to have or are not allowed to have, and what kind of discourse we are allowed to say or not allowed to say. For example, the Bisan Center, my organization, has a human rights-based approach to research and to human rights promotion. For the Israelis, this is also illegal because part of their declaration against the Bisan Center is that they are claiming that this is serving a terrorist ideology. And for us, this is a kind of criminalization that is systematic. People are becoming more and more afraid to talk. And we see also this falls a lot inside the kind of repression that's also happening by the PA in the West Bank. We also saw that in this summer, but on a much lower technological capabilities. They had to take, for example, to kidnap the phones from the activists in order to be able to physically take them, in order to be able to hack them. But this also falls part of the security coordination between the PA and the Israeli occupation.
No, absolutely. You invoked South Africa. I wanted to make sure I note that because, while South Africa is an example of apartheid, it's not the standard. So not everything has to fit perfectly with South Africa for Israel to be legitimately called an apartheid state. However, in this respect, there is a direct analogy because in South Africa, there were bans initiated on individual activists during the 1950s, and anti-apartheid political activists like Steve Biko and Ruth First and Winnie Mandela and others were jailed, tortured, or even killed while in police custody. So you have that direct analogy with what is happening to Palestinians living under occupation and under Israel's apartheid regime. I want to talk about the ICC element, Ubai, if you can comment on that, because Al-Haq and the 6 organizations, they provided an evidentiary basis for the demand to open a criminal investigation by the ICC. I believe Al-Haq submitted arguments before the pretrial chamber in 2019, and then in 2021, the prosecutor announced the decision to open criminal investigations. These 6 organizations had a direct impact toward that. Did that contribute to the designation in any way?
Well, look, not all 6 organizations, if you want to be clear. There are 3 organizations that their work focuses, or part of it focuses on the ICC, which are DCI International, Defense for Children International Palestine Chapter, Al-Haq, and Ad-Damir. The 3 others, OAC, Union of Agricultural Workers Committee, Bisan, and Union of Palestinian Women's Committee, work mostly on Palestinian steadfastness in Area C, on Palestinian or self-organizing of the community, on trying to also identify, for example, in our part, the power structures and violations that are systematic, and how the neoliberal system plays with the Israeli occupation system and with with the clientele system of the PA. This is, for example, our work. But on that note also, the phones of the people responsible for the ICC file in the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs were also hacked. So there's also a clear link there. And for our part, for example, with Bisan, Israel has targeted us even before this declaration. I was arrested in 2019, 1 week before participating in the apartheid conference in Istanbul, and a couple of days before addressing the European Parliament on the torture of Palestinian prisoners that happened in 2019, which was a very publicized case. On a second level, our offices were broken into by the Israeli army even before these declarations in July. And during the months between July and August, I was also arrested twice by the PA for demanding democratic and free elections and justice for the murder of the martyr Nizar Banat. So this kinds of, when you're talking about it, we as a Palestinian civil society, we see ourselves also fighting for a better future. And we have our tools. Our tools are human rights. Our tools are civic rights. Our tools are education. Our tools are embedded in international humanitarian law. And with these kinds of tools, I think also we made the Israeli government really uncomfortable with the idea that the Palestinian community is self-organizing. And this kind of self-organizing was even declared, even in the summer, even before these declarations, that Israel was not comfortable with. The Israeli Minister of Communications, for example, about 2 months before the declarations, said the PA should clean up the garbage from the streets of Ramallah. And when he used that term in the streets of Ramallah back then, we as civil society, among other actors in the Palestinian community, were going out in the streets demanding freedom, emancipation, accountability for the murder of Nizar Banat, and democratic elections. And this kind of self-organizing, Israel was evident that it's really not comfortable with. So what we are seeing here is a big attempt. On the one hand, they are trying to silence the international voices like Al-Haq and Al-Damir and DCI that are doing on the international arena. On the other hand, they are also trying to re-engineer the Palestinian community to become more complacent, more friendly towards the occupation, and I would say serve the purposes of the occupation instead of serving the purposes of the Palestinian people, which we ourselves are part of. Although I'm a dual citizen, but I also see myself as fully as part of the Palestinian community where I live my life, and I see myself also as an American that has some kind of privileges, even when compared with my fellow Palestinians that are living here.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, the designation itself, since you have been arrested and you have been targeted beforehand, what does this designation do in addition to that? Is it? I mean, did Israel really need to have this designation to do what it has been doing already? What is that additional thing or things or steps that Israel can take now with this designation that can harm you even more?
Look, for us as Palestinians, our lives, even if you have whatever kind of citizenship or diplomatic immunity, it means nothing. Once you're a Palestinian, you lose all your rights, and this is documented. For our part, our lives, our organizations were not immune to Israeli violations even before that. But what used to happen before that is that when Israelis used to attack us, for example, in my incarceration in 2019, there was a big international campaign for my release that was signed on by activists, professors, human rights defenders, Nobel laureates, scholars like Noam Chomsky, and others globally, and even inside the Israeli academia, for one part, that are against the occupation. So this kind of voice is really uncomfortable for the Israeli occupation. What they have done with this declaration is make the essence of our work illegal. For example, just like for communicating with us, Tariq and Adam, if you visit Israel, you can be incarcerated according to Israeli law up to 3 years for showing support and sympathy towards declared terrorist organizations. It's a totally draconian law. It's meant to isolate us, bring fear among the people, and also target any free voices, whether inside the Israeli community or from the international community, that might have a business or to come to historic Palestine or come through Israeli or have any dealings with Israel. So this kind of systematic targeting is, I would say, even worse than the ones that were did in South Africa. Actually, there was a very good article that compared between the apartheid system of South Africa and the one being used by Israel against us as Palestinians. And the deduction was that the system here is being used as worse. In South Africa, they didn't have separate roads for the blacks and the whites. Here they have separate roads. In South Africa, there wasn't this kind of complete judicial two-tier systems. Here we have it. This is a two-tier system. In South Africa, they didn't criminalize civil society organizations en masse. Here they are doing that. So this kind of disposition, this kind of repression, I think Israel is doing much worse. And it falls inside the overall paradigm of the continued ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, which is a main part of it, as was stated, is trying also to destroy the Palestinian narrative. When we're talking about destroying the Palestinian narrative, if I want just to go on a more analytical level, all Palestinian civil society reflects the Palestinian narrative, whether inside the Palestinian community in itself or for the international audience that it communicates with. So this kind of outlawing of these kinds of organization, yes, you are attempting to destroy the Palestinian narrative. If there are no messengers to convey the story, then the message will not be sent away.
If I could just actually follow that point up, because it complements that, I think, well, but also explains a little bit how it's not just the systematic targeting, but there's another element of this targeting that the spyware in particular is nefarious and is problematic for, and that is the gender component of it. As with most things, there is a gender component to the use and deployment of this spyware. And what we've already seen in other examples, the most famous example of which is the Al Jazeera journalist Ghada Owais, who was targeted by Saudi and Emirati actors, which used Pegasus to infiltrate her devices and then extract photos, private photos that she of her and her family, and doing other activities in her private life. That were then posted on public media and presented in a way, or altered to present in a way, to suggest that she was somebody with low morals or promiscuous or other kinds of like ridiculous attacks against her, but which play in the kind of gendered space that is, in many cultures and contexts, and are used to discredit her and to defame her. Including, in some cases, not in her case, but in other cases, within the family context. So getting to Ubai's point about trying to silence the narrative and who's telling it, another way that this is deployed is to silence Palestinian women in particular, by using the potential use of this technology to make women, first of all, become a specific target, and the risk that carries with it, that their reputation will be damaged in a way that has consequences beyond professional consequences. But then even more importantly is an intimidation factor that would make people pull back and not be active and not speak up and not tell their narrative and not tell their story, for fear that they could be exposed in a way with completely innocent and things that are not relevant to anything, photos or text or whatever, but then are deployed and used in a fake, fabricated propaganda way to undermine their credibility with their society, with their family, with other members. Even just simple things like private photos of women who normally would be wearing hijab, but private photos of them in their own room or something like that without hijab. Posting those publicly can carry consequences in the social realm that could lead to people withdrawing and pulling back from the public space, from being actively involved in civil society, and therefore then erasing that narrative. And that's something that, the Israelis aren't alone in using this kind of tactic, but they are quite explicit about using it. We know from the way that Israeli interrogators psychologically torture male prisoners, especially, but also female prisoners, Palestinian prisoners. They use threats of rape, sexual abuse, exploiting, family members in other ways, bringing in mothers and other women to be sexually exploited, etc. This is a part and parcel of the status quo of the normal way that Israel practices its repression against Palestinians, and this carries over, of course, into the technological realm.
Right, and this practice is in this idea of painting the Palestinians in a very negative way to fulfill, short-term and long-term ends, has been practiced brutally in Gaza, where if people perceive if the public perceives the people in Gaza as terrorists, as wanting to destroy the only Jewish, the only democratic state in the Middle East, quote unquote, then bombing a bombing campaign indiscriminately throughout all of Gaza seems to be justified, because you're not hitting human beings, you're hitting you're hitting bad actors, and you see it in its less brutal form, and you see it in its most brutal form. So this tactic is something that I believe is losing traction here in the U.S. I think public opinion is slowly changing because of the work of Palestinian-led organizations here and also our solidarity organizations that have pushed this narrative to kind of counter the diminution of the Palestinian narrative, as Ubai mentioned. I want to highlight something here, and I want you to tell me if this is true, or if it plays any role in this. So the Haaretz reported that these organizations remain legal in the West Bank despite the minister's executive order. So for an organization to be declared a disallowed association in the West Bank, the commander of the IDF Central Command must issue an order, but the office has not done that. Is that true, and is something like that forthcoming?
Well, it was true when Haaretz reported on that. Unfortunately, on the 4th of November, also the Israeli military commander did this kind of declaration. So, which basically means that our lives, our offices, our bank accounts, our everything is now open to all kinds of violations, arrests, shootings, closures, etc. From my own understanding of how the military system works, it's actually just rubber stamping the political decisions. There's a political level behind that, and this kind of declaration is highly politicized. For us as Palestinian organizations, we have to understand that the way that we do not even have any rights. These declarations have not even been conveyed to us in any proper manner. We first knew of it through the media. It was not sent to us, even after we learned about it through the media. The Israeli military decision was also, we were informed of it in the media. The charges against us, we have not seen. These charges are being conveyed here and there to governments, and the expose that was done by The Intercept and Plus 972 magazine actually was the first time for me for seeing what they are charging us with and how ridiculous it is. This is the kind of secret evidence that they are using. So we are in this kind of limbo state, where you are accused without even having the ability to be proven innocent by secret evidence that you cannot know and you cannot counteract. And this kind of system is supposed to be, and this kind of practice is supposed to be done by as they say about themselves in quotations, which I do not believe in, of course, is the only democracy in the Middle East. So what kind of democracy uses secret evidence to crack down on civil society organization? What kind of democracy does public relations campaigns on the indictment, on a false indictment of a 62-year-old Juan Rishmau, for example, from health work committees, that even their own military court said no, the campaign that the Ministry of War, it's not the Ministry of Defense, and the Foreign Ministry, Israeli Foreign Ministry did are false. And this is by their own words, that their accusations are false on their own. And on another level, what kind of system it is that we as Palestinians do not even have the right to face our accusers or to face even the evidence that they are talking, that are saying against us as terrorists. And you have to understand also that the kind of justification that they are trying to give for declaring us as terrorist organizations, this is already punishable under the current military rule in the West Bank. Previously, they had to prove those offenses against us in order to take us even into the kangaroo court they call the Israeli military court in Judea and Samaria, which is their name of the West Bank. But now they can just charge us for working with Bisan. For example, if you've done a report for Bisan or done an interview for Bisan or done even an audit for Bisan, you might face charges in the Israeli military court for aiding and abetting a terrorist organization. This is how far they have taken these accusations. For our part, just for everyone to know, we do not believe in the Israeli legal system. And we've sent a letter for the military commander requesting the revealing of the secret evidence against us if they want us to go into a legal challenge against it. Because without revealing the evidence, how can anyone think about a due process?
And Ubai, and I don't know if you can speak for the other organizations, but has this affected the international donors and donors to Bisan? Is this hurting organizations financially right now? I mean, eventually it could, but as of right now, is it?
Well, look, there are so many levels for that. One level of it is that not all people working in civil society or in human rights, even donor countries, are standing up to their beliefs. And we are seeing that. We are seeing that some of them are not believing the Israeli discourse, but are chickening away, if I want to use that term, because they are afraid of Israeli repercussions. On other level, no, we have seen a large solidarity campaign globally. There's also our friends from Europe, for example, have started a fundraiser for us for Bisan on their website, which we didn't even have before that option. So we are seeing, on the most part, that there's more international cooperation, more international support for the 6 organizations. And I think this kind of international attention has really backfired on the Israeli designations. And we are actually hoping that this kind of attention, this kind of support will be translated into more sustainability for the Palestinian 6 organizations and Palestinian civil society in general. From the leaks that we have been hearing in the past couple of weeks, we heard the Israelis are wanting to designate another 10 Palestinian civil society organizations as terrorist organizations. We do not have the names yet, but we heard this leak from a credible source. And I think this is very dangerous as not enough international action has happened. So I urge everyone that's listening to us now in the United States, especially, to go on your computer, on your laptop, email your member of Congress or your member of Senate and tell them what have you done to face, to question your Ministry of State for the action they have done to counteract this kind of designation, this kind of grave human rights violation for recognized civil society organizations.
And one of the reasons we wanted to do this webinar is to make sure that this conversation keeps going. We don't want this to dissipate in any way, because it is something serious. And the fact that, as Adam mentioned, that the reaction was so visceral from the U.S. when the target was U.S. officials, but not when it's Palestinian human rights organizations, really just shows that we have a lot more work to do to make sure that we push this narrative forward and not let it die down. Adam, is NSO in trouble? There's recent reports about it being in debt, $500 million, and it risks defaulting. Is that as a result of what Ubai mentioned, the international pressure that has come as a result? I mean, what has contributed to that?
Yeah, I would say NSO is in trouble, and it wouldn't be the first cyber company like this to be in trouble. A number of years ago, back at the time of the popular protest movement in the Arab world, often referred to as the Arab Spring, there's an Italian company called Hacking Team, which similarly had sold cyber surveillance technology to states in the region and elsewhere, authoritarian governments, to use against their populations. And as a result of the work of human rights defenders in those countries and elsewhere to expose this, Hacking Team came under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of attention, and ultimately got sued in Italian courts. The European Union had to start introducing certain kind of approaches about restricting cyber spyware stuff. And Hacking Team eventually more or less went out of business. It claimed bankruptcy at one point. I think NSO is on a similar trajectory because these companies can only exist as long as nobody's paying attention to them. They can only exist as long as they're, doing business with authoritarian regimes and nobody's questioning, the nature of those relationships and the nature of those contracts. In this case, it's not just simply that a company was making contracts with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with even the government of Mexico, which isn't necessarily an authoritarian government, but has used Pegasus spyware against journalists and other governments. It's done so with the approval of the Israeli state. In every instance that NSO is selling its software to another actor, it has to be approved, because this is almost considered like weapon sales as far as the Israeli government is concerned. And so the Israeli government is on the hook here. It's an accomplice in every single instance of the deployment of Pegasus. In this case, against the Palestinian civil society groups, we also believe, and certainly Israel's actions to date would indicate, that actually it's the Israeli government itself that's the client of NSO. But even aside from that, it is at least an accomplice in everything. And so NSO is in trouble, certainly. And financially, it's in trouble. Its CEO that it recently appointed actually stepped down. So it's got a lot of problems. But we shouldn't stop, and companies like Apple and others shouldn't stop with the NSO group. It needs to continue on to question the Israeli state. Is the Israeli government itself enabling authoritarian regimes to target and attack human rights activists, journalists, and, in this case, American diplomats by virtue of its approval of these contracts or the use of this technology? And so the Israeli government needs to be held accountable. One last point to leave people on a slightly positive, hopefully positive note. Despite all that Ubai is saying and all the dangers of this technology and all the steps that the Israeli government has been taking to criminalize these organizations and declare them as terrorists, and the lack of will we're seeing by the international community to more robustly not just push back, but overturn and hold Israel accountable in some way. These steps that Israel is taking, the use of these kinds of procedures and tactics to introduce charges without any kind of judicial processes, without any kind of even the kangaroo court that Ubai mentioned, actually only helps make the case at the ICC that there is no domestic accountability for Israel, the Israeli government, when it comes to Palestinians. And therefore, by its own actions, Israel is proving day in and day out that an international arbiter is needed, that the International Criminal Court is needed in order to be able to assure justice, accountability, and fairness for the Palestinians, regardless of the outcome of the occupation, of apartheid, or anything else. Just simply being able to investigate and hold criminal activity accountable, Israel is proving this day in and day out by its own actions, even more so than by the fake investigation committees that get set up to look into, the bombing of this or the bombing of that. The way it's targeting these Palestinian organizations and deploying the use of the terrorism label is, foreign governments, the US government, the UK, France, all these governments should take this as an attack on themselves, because this system that was created in the wake of 9/11 to identify terrorism, to stop financial transfers to terrorists, to securitize the international community to prevent terrorism, if we accept that in some way, and these governments certainly do accept it, right? They build entire policies on this. What Israel has done has made a joke. It has made a complete mockery of all of that with this case, with the naming of these 6 organizations. And I should say, not just these 6, but also a 7th organization, the Health Work Committees, of whom 2 of its members are sitting in jail, and which was the basis, the fabricated evidence from the interrogation of former Health Work Committee employees was used to target these 6 organizations, as exposed by The Intercept and N972. And I encourage you to read those articles to show exactly how this all is a fabrication and is a mockery of the entire system. If that system exists and these officials in the US and France and the UK and Germany and elsewhere believe in it, then they need to stand up for their own sake, not just for the Palestinian sake, for their own sake, for their own security reasons, to stand up to Israel and say, no, you can't make a joke. You can't make a mockery of what we have set up here just to accomplish your own political ends because you can't carry out apartheid without opposition.
Thank you, Adam, for that. And before we conclude, I want to shift it over to Ubai. We shared 2 links on here. Hadith, if you can, please share them again. And then I want Ubai to talk about them briefly.
Okay, so look, what I want to say is that people here are not powerless. We have the power. We are the majority. It's our rights that are being violated. It's not just the Palestinian people's rights. It's not just the people that are working for civil society, but all of our rights as, if I want to say, international citizens, whether you're a simple person who's living and working in the United States, an average dad or an average person that goes to work every day and might face this kind of repression or systematic surveillance if it's not stopped here and now, or you're someone who's in an Arab country that is also facing some kind of dictatorship that also does grave human rights violations, like the case of Jamal Khashoggi. So people have the power to do action. And it's for people like Adam Shapiro and Frontline Defenders that are stepping up, that are proving every day, and with, of course, American Muslims for Palestine and other organizations are proving every day that action, collective action, can have an effect. For us, we share 2 links. The first one is for if you want to do any material support for Bisan to make sure that the work we are doing, you would like to see it continue, and you believe in this work, and you believe in the message that we are sending the people. So please go ahead and you can donate to us through our partners, Viva Salud, which we've been working with for the past 5 years and aim to continue working with for many more years to come. On the second link, it's a website that has come as a collective volunteer effort from civil society organizations that are working on digital security. They did a website for the 6, Support the 6, where they have resources, materials, where you can take tweet samples, where you can also have this kind of message that you want to send your people, members of parliament or Congress or heads of state or ministers of foreign affairs like Minister Blinken for the United States or Borrell for the European Union. And this kind of collective action is heard, and people are listening and looking at that a lot these days. For us also, these kinds of links offer the opportunity for people to be posted on the news on what's happening on the ground with the 6 organizations and with the daily lives of Palestinians living under occupation and apartheid system. So please share, and all power to the people, and the people have all the power.
Absolutely. I really want to thank both of you for sharing your expertise, your wisdom, your knowledge, and your experience on this very crucial topic that I hope stays relevant, because we definitely want the Palestinian narrative and we want the truth about what is happening to Palestinian civil society and beyond to be known to the public, especially here in the United States. The public here are slowly growing in their appreciation for what the Palestinians are struggling for, and they are definitely embracing the organizations that are pushing for justice and freedom and liberation for the Palestinian people. I did want to end on a very, very positive note before we leave. I've just been informed that Algeria scored their 2nd goal against Tunisia to win the Arab World Cup, and it looks like fans from both teams are raising Palestinian flags. So obviously, this is definitely a people struggle, and everybody's in love with this Palestinian struggle for liberation and justice. And Ubai, you took yourself off mute. Did you want to say something?
Yes, all love to Algeria, Tunisia, especially. Look, the team of Algeria has been wonderful. Even when the Palestinians played against the Algerian team, the Algerians chanted for the Palestinians. So they are amazing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you both are amazing. And Adam, you took yourself off mute as well. So did you have a final comment?
No, just to say thank you. And of course, love for the Algerian team and the Algerian people. And I think we need to do some chanting in Palestine for Algerian protests for freedom and civil rights there. So it needs to go both ways also.
Yes, of course.
I've always said this: if you're progressive just on Palestine, you're not a comrade. And if you're just progressive on everything else except for Palestine, same thing. You have to be that way across the board. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing your time. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, Tariq.
Thank you, Ubai. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.